So I just want to walk through the case where you have two curves shifting at the same time and why it can make it a little difficult to understand what happened either to price or quantity. So I just want to go through a few concepts right now. So first, if you just shift one curve, like you shift demand to the right, every time demand would shift to the right, you would see a higher price in the market and a higher quantity. Now, if demand shifts to the left, you would always see a lower price and a lower quantity. Now, that is just when the demand curve is shifting. So when one curve is shifting, it's pretty clear what happens to price and quantity. Let's do that for the supply side now too. So when supply increases, you'll see lower price. So price went from here down here towards zero, so lower price, and quantity increases. So anytime a curve, whether it's a supply curve or a demand curve, shifts to the right, the quantity in the market's going to increase. If the curve shifts to the left, the quantity in the market's going to decrease. So if supply shifts to the left, then quantity in the market goes down, so quantity is decreasing, but price increases. So when only one curve is shifting, it's pretty clear what happens to price and quantity. Now, when you have two curves shifting, you end up with a scenario where one of the variables will be ambiguous, meaning you can't determine its direction unless you know which curve has shifted in a larger magnitude. So let's go through a concept real quick to kind of illustrate this. Let's say you have a scenario where supply curve shifts to the right and demand curve shifts to the left. So when supply shifts to the right, you'll see that that lowers prices and increases quantity, okay? When demand shifts to the left, that causes price to go down and quantity to go down. So let's say we have both these events happening at the same time. Supply shifts to the right and demand shifts to the left. Now, when it comes to the price, there's no question what happens to price. Price in the market goes down. Why? The supply shift to the right lowers price and the demand shift to the left lowers price. So you have two events both causing lower price. The sum of those two events has to be that the price will drop in the market. Now, when it comes to quantity, it depends on which shift is larger. Why? When demand shifts to the left, that lowers quantity. But when supply shifts to the right, that raises quantity. So you have those two forces opposing each other. One shift is increasing quantity, the other shift is lowering quantity. And you could have a scenario where quantity went up, quantity went down, quantity stayed exactly the same. It depends on which shift is larger. Now, if you notice the scenario that's sketched here, the size of the shifts are identical. So since the size of the shifts are identical, the quantity stays the same. That means the demand reduction, so demand shifting to the left, was exactly equal in the size of the supply curve shifting to the right. So maybe when supply shifted to the right, it increased the quantity by 5 units, but when demand shifted to the left, it reduced the quantity by 5 units. The end result is the quantity stays exactly where it was in the original equilibrium. Now, you could have ended up with two other scenarios for quantity. So the scenario where quantity could have increased compared to the original equilibrium would be the scenario where the supply shift was larger than the demand shift. So imagine you move the supply curve farther to the right, and let's say it went over this far. And now you would hit the demand curve here, and you would see that the equilibrium quantity would be larger than the original equilibrium quantity. So when the curve shifting to the right, the supply curve shifting to the right, was larger in magnitude than the demand curve shifting to the left, then the quantity in the market would increase. Now, what if you had a scenario where the demand shift was larger in magnitude than the supply shift? If the demand shift was larger, that means the shift to the left of the demand curve would overpower the supply curve shifting to the right. So let's say you shifted the demand curve even larger, by a larger amount to the left. So if you shifted it here to the left, farther over, you would hit the supply curve here, and you would see that the market quantity would have went down. So you really do not know what happens to quantity unless you know what shift is larger. That's why if you don't know which shift is larger, the quantity is considered ambiguous, meaning you don't know its direction. It could have went up, it could have went down, it could have stayed exactly the same. There's three possible outcomes for quantity. Notice there's only one possible outcome for price in this scenario because both shifts cause price to go down. Supply shifting to the right lowers prices, demand shifting to the left lowers prices. So since both those events lower price, price is not ambiguous. It's known what happens to price. Price will go down in the market. Now let's go through real quickly the scenario that you could have where price would be ambiguous. So price will be ambiguous when the two curves are moving in the same direction. Either both curves are shifting to the right or both curves are shifting to the left. Let's do the scenario where both curves shift to the right. So once again, if demand shifts to the right, that causes prices to go up. So price goes up, quantity also goes up. When supply shifts to the right, prices go down, quantity goes up. So you have, once again, two forces opposing each other, but here it's now price moving in opposite direction. Supply shifting to the right causes price to go down. Demand shifting to the right causes price to go up. So how do you determine what happens to price? You need to know what shift is larger. Now, you know what happens to quantity in the scenario because when both curves shift to the right, both of those events, when supply shifts to the right and demand shifts to the right, both of those events cause a larger quantity in the market. So quantity is not ambiguous in this market. We know what happens to quantity. But in order to determine what happens to price, we need to know what shift was larger. There's three outcomes for price. Price could have stayed the same. Price could have went up, price could have went down. So let's do the scenario again. Supply shifts to the right, demand shifts to the right. And we see with this scenario, notice the size of the shifts, the demand size and the supply size. The magnitude of these shifts are exactly the same. So let's say when demand shifted to the right, that was causing price to go up by $5. But when supply shifted to the right, that caused price to go down by $5. The end result is price stays exactly the same. Those two forces canceled each other out. The increase in price from demand was completely canceled by the reduction in price when supply shifted to the right. Now, what would give you a scenario where prices would go up? The demand curve would have to shift by a larger magnitude than the supply curve. So if demand shifted by a larger magnitude, price in the market would rise. Now, what would be the scenario where price in the market would go down? Well, what if supply shifted by a larger magnitude? Let's say supply shifted by, twice the amount as what's listed here. So you'd have a supply curve hitting the demand curve here, and you would see that market prices would go down. So for market prices to drop, the supply shift would have had to be larger than the demand shift. For market prices to go up, the demand shift would have had to been larger than the supply shift. And when prices stayed the same, then when you have the scenario where prices stayed the same, that means the two shifts are exactly the same in their magnitude, like what's listed here, and therefore price doesn't change at all. So price would be ambiguous in this scenario, meaning you don't know what happens to it unless you know what shift is larger. For example, if you know that the demand shift was larger than the supply shift, then in this scenario you would know prices would go up. If you knew that the supply shift was larger than the demand shift, you would know that prices would go down. And if you know that they're the same size, the same magnitude of shifts, then you would know price would be the same. One final thing here, in this scenario, quantity is not ambiguous in any case because both curves are shifting to the right, which means both events are increasing quantity, so we know for sure that quantity would go up. We don't even need to know the magnitudes of the shifts to determine quantity because both shifts are causing or impacting quantity the same way. They're raising quantity.